Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK Road to MSI Round 3 overview and analysis video. We've got two series to cover today, but we're going to be doing them in a very different way. The first series, of course, we're going to go a bit out of chronological order. We'll be covering in the way that you've kind of gotten used to here on the LCK, not only for all of the regular season games that we covered, but for the playoff games so far as well, where we're going to be talking about the series as a whole and just kind of going into how things ended up going down in a general sense. And then we've got technically our championship matchup here to determine the #1 seed from the LCK going to MSI and kind of the de facto champions of the spring split. That will be covered in a game-by-game breakdown rather than a series-by-series breakdown. So I hope you guys are excited. Quite a lot of content in today's video. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from these two series? Did they live up to your expectations, or were you surprised by the output of both of these teams? Of course, I'll kind of talk about where I land on that spectrum as we go throughout the video, but let's go ahead and get into it. Like I said, if you are new here, what we're going to do is kind of flip back and forth between series by series and game by game, depending on the series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series in total for the first one, player of the game and dud of the game for every single game in our championship matchup, and then of course a player of the series, kind of a de facto finals MVP. Like really, if you want to go that way, this is basically the championship finals series between these two teams. So a lot to talk about here today. Of course, by the end of the video, we're going to preview our last matchup, our technical final matchup, even if it isn't technically the finals, the team that will qualify second from the LCK for MSI, but that will be saved for the end of the video. Most of today will be spent talking about the two series we got. But like I also said at the beginning of the video, we're going to go a bit out of chronological order. Typically, I like to just go in the order that these series happen, regardless of if that's the easiest to follow. But for me, I think it just made the most sense in terms of structuring this video to talk about kind of the less important series first and then get into the game-by-game breakdown of the big final. So that means we're going to start off with the one that just happened a couple of hours ago as of filming this video, the lower bracket matchup, to determine who will get the chance to play the loser of our finals for that spot at MSI. Who's going to be able to stay alive? It was a matchup between the #3 seeded T1 and the #5 seeded KT Rolster that T1 is going to be able to take 3-1. They're going to be able to pick up this series, and quite frankly, they're going to do it in pretty good fashion. I think you can talk about some of the ups and downs, we'll say, of KT Rolster throughout this series, but generally, this is just where the miracle run for KT comes to an end. A telecom war once again going in favor of T1. It feels like this is happening every year at this point. These two teams are pretty consistently playing off in these big best-of-5s in the playoffs, and yet T1 is still coming out on top basically every single time it matters. Credit to KT again. They've been unbelievable over the second half of the year. We kind of talked about them as if they were like a real threat to go to MSI, and I think they absolutely were. Unfortunately, T1 actually played up to their own standards today, which has been the only thing that's really held them individually back as a team, and that meant that KT really struggled to be able to get off the ground. Some big moments and some step-up moments from some players on T1 really kind of nails the coffin shut for KT Rolster, and again, unfortunately for them, their end of spring miracle run comes to an end here. But let's go ahead and talk about the series itself. I predicted T1 to be able to win this. I thought it was going to be relatively close. In fact, I think I predicted it to go to 5 games. I thought these two teams were going to be pretty back and forth. I predicted both of the series in today's video to go 5, but T1 was even better than I think I expected them to be. We knew they were going to come out with something to prove because this team absolutely should be a top 3 team, and they definitely want to go to MSI, but to see everyone really step up in the way that they did in different times and different moments, but generally to see everyone step up at points in this series is a really big positive, and specifically, my player of the series is going to go to Doran in the top lane. You can look at the negative plays, you can look at the up and down moments, but at the end of the day, he got the Baron when it mattered the most, and he was basically able to win this series for T1. Not just that, but I think he actually played a lot of these team fights incredibly well. When you're thinking back on the player that influenced this series in the most positive direction for T1, I really do believe that Doran ends up falling into that. I think there are going to be some detractors of that statement, if only because Doran wasn't quite as useful as maybe some of the other members in the actual fights, like in the actual 5v5s or setting things up. But in terms of the clutch pivotal moments in this series, I think Doran was the one to kind of carry things through. And you know what? It's certainly not the first time he's done that in the domestic playoffs in the LCK. For this, for all the talk and the reputation that Doran gets for being this big moment underperformer, really that is only applied to Worlds. Like every other tournament, even MSI, it's not really been the case for a player like Doran. He has been really good in a lot of these big moments. These best of 5s are actually where Doran generally shines. lines, especially domestically here in the LCK. It's legitimately just been the World Championships where sometimes he can, fall a little bit under the expectation ladder, but he was awesome in this series, definitely was better than perfect for a majority of this. I think specifically in game number 3, you can point out the big moments on the Camille in game number 4, and trust me, like I have already, but the Renekton was huge in game number 3. It wasn't just like a one-game wonder thing for Doran. I actually do believe he was the best player on the Rift, and I think that there was a lot to like about his individual performance, and I think generally with T1 fans being sour on him as a player and not really super bought into the idea of Doran being the Zeus replacement with Zeus playing so well for Hanwha life and being an MVP candidate, all of that stuff. I think people were really hoping to get a performance like this out of him just to kind of prove that he can do it on this roster. And, I think this kind of alleviates a lot of fears from T1 fans in terms of whether or not Doran has the ability to step up and actually perform like he has on previous teams like Gen.G and Hanwha Life at this level for T1. I think the rest of this team was also great, though. Keria was incredible in this series, and I don't think he's going to get enough credit for just how well he played. Again, big moments in game number 4 on the Rel, but even outside of that, the Rakan game in game 2, the Bard game in game number 3, if he didn't throw away game 1 by picking Elise support and playing something that was basically unplayable, they probably would have won that game as well, because it was kind of a 4v5 at the end of that game, and KT was just, they had enough firepower to be able to win that with the amount of engage that they had with Wukong, Nico, Ornn, all of that stuff. Elise being basically useless in the back half of that game really ended up costing them, but once Keria was on these playmakers that could actually do something in a lot of these games, because Rakan, Bard, Rel, they're some of the biggest playmakers in the meta right now. Once Keria was actually able to function, he was excellent in this series, and that's a big step up. He's been a player that's kind of flown under the radar for me throughout this split. He's really not been all that eye-catching or impressive in terms of the plays that he's making. He's absolutely fallen out of best support in the world conversations. He might not even be a top 3 support in the LCK. I think that there is a legitimate argument to make that there are 3 better supports in Duro, Delight, and Lehens right now than Keria in terms of just what the production has been this year. And so for him to step up in a pretty big moment, kind of reestablish himself as somebody that, if given the opportunity to be a primary playmaker, is going to be able to come out and make it worth it. It's really good to see that. Gumayusi went 36, 5, and 29. Now, was he as relevant as that scoreline would indicate? Maybe not. It was still a very great series, a lot of that coming in, some of the early games in this series, but even things like the Ziggs in game number 4, being willing to take a step back, that was always the thing that made T1 so dangerous with Guma in the bot lane, and the reason that I think, some people would like him over Smash is that Smash is much more of a, resource-heavy player. He wants to be more of a main character. He wants to play these hyper carries in the bot lane. Guma is much more comfortable playing weak side bot, and I think we kind of saw that in the series on things like Jhin and Ziggs, where they actually found a ton of success. Even Lucian, to an extent, can kind of just do his own thing in the mid game because he's going to be useful in skirmishes no matter what. And so you can leave Guma on that island. Owner can invest resources elsewhere. Keria can invest resources elsewhere, or they can play towards Guma. We know he can play strong side as well. I'm not trying to say that he's only a weak side bot lane player. He can do a lot of different things, but generally Guma's flexibility is one of his best assets and one of his biggest traits. And that's certainly, I think, his biggest advantage over someone like Smash. And I think we saw that in this series. Faker was totally fine. I really had no issue with the way that Faker played. Ironically enough, he was probably the player I thought about the least in this series. Owner had a really great one going into Cuz, who's been on fire. As of late, this guy has been absolutely unreal over the second half of the split. Maybe best jungler in the league if you just took the final 3 weeks of the regular season, and Owner obviously was the best jungler in the league for me throughout the entirety of the split. And so it was nice to see him kind of stake his claim by being the better jungler for most of this series. But just kind of everything clicking for T1, really everything working, and a lot of, positive drafts, a lot of positive setups, and, late game execution, just being clutch in these big moments. That's what T1 is known for, and that's what they did once again against their telecom rivals. And for KT Rolster, obviously you're going to feel a bit disappointed because I think this team had pretty high expectations coming in to a series like this. Quite frankly, they were hotter than a T1 team that really struggled down the stretch in the regular season. This team went 0-2 in the final week of the regular season going into this matchup, T1 that is, and I think KT just kind of had it in their brains okay, we got 2-3-0s. We had yet to lose a game in the playoffs. We're going to be just fine at least competing in this series, and that didn't really end up happening. That being said, I think they played fine, and there were a couple of moments where I think things were okay. BDD once again had a pretty awesome series, and I would actually argue that at times BDD was the better mid laner here, and I'm not going to spoil my mid lane rankings, not only going into obviously international tournaments, but going into the LCK for the summer split. But right now, Faker might be outside of that top 3. BDD has really made his case to be in that upper echelon, and this series kind of backed that up a little bit. A couple of bad performances that ended up being a bit problematic, but for the most part, not only was his Rise game in game number 1 incredibly important towards KT's success, but he was really consistent throughout the rest of the series as well. I think you could say similar things, if not like maybe less so, about Dektum and Peter. I think that there were some moments that were really bad from both of them where they were just overextended. Oftentimes Dektum kind of playing out of his own role that he's kind of built for himself, and the player that we've talked about in Dektum, where he's kind of this jack of all trades, master of none. He was really greedy in this series to try and generate resources, and obviously a lot of resources for T1 were put into shutting things like the Xayah down in game number 4. But if he had played a tad bit safer, especially because you're playing Xayah Braum in the bot lane, like so much PL, so much safety coming down on the bottom side of the map, if you were just a tad bit more survivable in some of these fights, maybe things changed just a little bit. That being said, that might be a bit of a nitpick because he was really the only one with any resources in the back half of this series. But Dektum and Peter were not as good as Gumayusi and Keria. They've been great throughout this playoff run. I would argue they've been the best lane for KT Rolster throughout this playoff run. They just couldn't keep it going in this one. But my biggest problem with this team was absolutely the top side of the map. Perfect and Cuz, I think, both played quite poor in comparison to what they've been recently. Whoever you want to give dud of the series to out of these two, I think is entirely fine. If you want to give it to Cuz because he couldn't land a smite to save his life, I think that's kind of up to you. And part of those were not his fault. Like, I want to make that abundantly clear. Even some of them, he didn't have a chance to smite, right? Like, they weren't even 50-50s, but the fact that KT put so much pressure into trying to set up these 50-50s, cough, cough, game 4, is kind of the fault of Cuz and kind of the fault of the setups of KT Rolster. I do have to give him at least a little bit of blame for that. Even on top of that, there were some performances that weren't great. I don't think the Jarvan game was good at all in game 2. There were a lot of moments on the Pantheon in game 4 that I think ended up being negative, but at the end of the day, I think Perfect's individual gameplay was just a tad bit worse, and he was certainly less effective over the course of this series than someone like Cuz was, and so he ends up getting dead of the series. Most specifically on this Yorick in game number 3. This was awful from Perfect. It's probably the worst game anyone played in this series was that Yorick game, and it just ended up really putting KT behind. Not to say he was awful on the Rumble or the Mbessa in their other losses. He was okay in those games, but Doran was certainly more relevant in the back half of this series, and he probably had that worst game in game number 3, so he ends up being the de facto dud of the series. But again, these guys have been very good in this playoff run and down the stretch. I'm not going to freak out about this team, but the reality of the situation is that KT is better than all the teams outside the upper echelon, and T1 still is a team that deserves to be considered in the upper echelon. So for KT, they just can't break that top 3 just yet, but they might be sitting very firmly as the 4th best team in the LCK. For T1, they want to get higher than that. They're going to play the loser of the series that we're going to talk about next, and that's a series to determine who goes to MSI. We know this org has international expectations because they're T1, and they really, really feel like they should be top 2. Right now, they're looking better than they did at the end of the regular season, but it might even take a further step up over what they were in this series in order to guarantee that against either Gen.G or HLE. But now that we've got the lower bracket series out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the big one, the de facto finals here in the LCK Spring Split. I know I've said that a couple of times in this video. I know it's not the final series, nor is there technically a championship or an actual finals. Whoever wins this series isn't getting a banner in the rafters or anything like that. But really, in terms of the Spring Split and just isolating what has happened in this section of the year, whoever wins this series is the #1 team in the LCK. Like, they're not only going to MSI as the #1 seed from the LCK, which obviously doesn't matter quite as much considering that this region won first stand, so both of their teams get to skip the play-ins, but, you know, they're kind of the team to beat moving into the rest of the year. There is no technical finals. This is the last series that whoever wins is going to be playing, and that is enough for me to call it a finals or a championship or whatever you want to call it. This is the biggest series of the playoffs of the road to MSI, in my opinion. Of course, we should introduce the teams. It's the #1 seeded Gen.G taking on the #2 seeded Hanwha Life Esports, and the reason this matchup is so interesting is because I think it's been a clear top 2 for basically all of this year. I like what T1 or KT Rolster or even D+K in the winter split, like I like what they've been doing, and I like the fact that they've made things more competitive for, you know, some of these teams. But at the end of the day, like, the top 2 have been pretty clear so far in 2025, and Gen.G and HLE are those top 2. HLE, of course, looking to replicate their performance from the winter split where they were able to take down Gen.G in a best of 5 to win the winter split, to go on to represent the region at the First Stand International Tournament. But Gen.G have not only bounced back incredibly well in the spring split since HLE became your first international champions of 2025, but Gen.G have yet to lose a series so far since that finals matchup. They were 18-0 in the regular season, and that means they're going in with as much momentum as is humanly possible. This team, I believe, only lost like 5 or 6 games throughout the entirety of the spring split, like even including the fact that, they were losing, or winning series 2-1. Like, that's how dominant this team was. They actually were just a full tier above everybody else and what people consider to be the strongest region in the entire world. And that's what Gen.G is entering this series with in terms of the confidence that they have. Now, HLE do have a couple of things going for them in terms of them potentially being better in a series like this. Not only can you look at a couple of positions and actually maybe favor HLE as a team? Like, you could look at, top lane and be like, yeah, Zeus is probably better than Keen right now. Zeus is just absolutely on fire. This guy has been unreal. You can look at support and be like, Duro is a player who, has maybe been better than Delight this split in particular. I put him first team All-Pro for a reason, but Delight has significantly more top-end experience playing in big best of 5s, and he was way better than Duro in the finals the last time these two teams played. You can look at a couple of those positions and see where HLE could actually come out on top. Add that on to the fact that this Hanwha Life team, and specifically players like Zeka on this team, are notorious for stepping up in gigantic moments, for being clutch players and really being able to make the moment count. And so now you're looking at a series where, yes, Gen.G is going into it as favorites, and they definitely are the team to beat right now in the LCK. You can't go undefeated in the regular season without earning that title, but they're certainly not the only plausible outcome to win this series. HLE have a very real shot of replicating what they did just a couple of months ago, even if they weren't able to do it in the regular season. As for what I predicted in this series, I predicted Gen.G, but I did 3-2. I thought this was going to go to 5 games. I said that in the previous video, and honestly, the reason I believe that is just because I think HLE is not going to go down in a playoff series without a fight. Do I think Gen.G is the better team right now? Yes, I do believe that until they are proven to be beatable, they are unbeatable in terms of what their current iteration is. But at the end of the day, if any team has the formula to be able to beat Gen.G, it's this Hanwha Life team, who beat them in winter finals, who beat them in summer finals of last year as well. They understand what they need to do, and if Zeka can come out and be better than someone like Chovy in the matchup, that opens up everything. If Peanut can come out and outplay Canyon, which is super realistic, that completely opens up the matchup. Viper and Ruler, I think, are almost completely equal in terms of skill level, like on a game-to-game basis, even if I think Ruler has been more productive across this year. This is a big matchup for HLE that I think if they end up winning it, they are kind of the Godslayers in the LCK. They are the ones to take down the top of the mountain over and over again. If Gen.G can win this series, though, they end out their spring split completely undefeated, not having dropped a single series across the entire split, which would be one of the most historic records in LCK history. So I'm excited to see where this goes. Again, my prediction was Gen.G just because it's so hard to predict against the undefeated team losing, but I'm excited to see. The only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game 1. So without further ado, let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is the exact thing that Gen.G couldn't really allow to happen. Going down 0-1 in a series like this is already a bit of a disadvantage. It means you have to have at least a 50% win rate against the team that just beat you, a Hanwha Life team that's very, very good. And quite frankly, this game is super interesting to talk about because it was very back and forth. Quite frankly, there's no justification for Gen.G not winning this game. They had such a gigantic lead. Even as late as like 35, 40 minutes into the game, it really felt like this wasn't going to be throwable because Chovy was playing so unbelievably well. You had something like a Gwen scaling on the top side, and it really did feel like they just had full control of the entire map. But at the end of the day, one gigantic mistake can end up knocking your entire team down a peg, and that's exactly, unfortunately, what happened to Gen.G. For Hanwha Life on the other side, they were there to capitalize on that mistake, and it's ironic because I'm going to talk about the drafts here, the format that we kind of go for this game by game because we haven't done it in the LCK, is that we're going to give about a 2 to 3 minute talk about the drafts, kind of going over what my expectations were and whether or not these teams played out their drafts well, whether or not I think, they understood their win conditions, all of that stuff. And then we'll kind of talk about, the rest of the game from their specific moments that ended up standing out to me. But really, when you talk about draft in this series, you're talking about a Gen.G team that's playing around Xin Zhao, Talia, Jin, that probably doesn't want this game to go 49 minutes. Like, if you would have told me this went 49 minutes and Gen.G had a lead and then it completely disappeared, I would have been like, yeah, that's exactly exactly how things are supposed to go with these two drafts, with Xin Zhao, Talia, Jin wanting to play through the mid game, and then eventually like Rumble, Azir, Varus with like a ton of engage with Rel, and Poppy potentially being there for Peel, like that comp one in the late game. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's how stuff like this traditionally is going to go, but it wasn't really like that. You actually can't just look at the comps and be like, well, late game team won late game. Like that is not how this went at all. You're looking at a draft situation where HLE actually ended up getting a small lead, but at least a lead early on in the game that they ended up throwing around 20 to 25 minutes because Chovy's really good at Talia, and then Gen.G feel like they're just like spiraling the game out of control. From that point onwards, their lead grows larger and larger and larger through the Baron acquisitions that they have, through Otacon that lets them, basically win every fight that they want to take until a certain point where they don't anymore, and then it's up to Hanwha Life to have to actually pull back the early lead that they were able to generate. Lucky for them, they were able to do so, but again, to me, this had more to do with kind of the misplays coming in from Gen.G than it did from HLE not, following up. Like, they were really good, and we're going to talk about their great performances, but less so the draft, more so the actual gameplay itself that ended up impacting these games. But player of the game for me, at least in game one, is going to go to Viper in the bot lane. I just couldn't possibly give it to anybody else. Peanut was incredible down the stretch here on his signature champion in the Poppy, the one that I associate the most with him individually as a player. That and the Maokai, I think, are definitely the two that kind of float to a lot of people's brains, but Viper was simply too good in this game to ignore. For player of the game, his positioning was like A+++ tier. Like, this is just one of those games where, Varus is the most consistent AD carry in the game at the moment in terms of marksman and the damage output that he can do both early and late. And if you have a team that's good at being able to facilitate him as a champion, then yeah, he can actively be a primary carry, which most people don't think of Varus as, but oh my goodness, Viper obliterated this game. It actually wasn't even remotely close. His positioning was gorgeous, his damage output was insane, and again, like even with the mistakes coming in from Gen.G, Viper wasn't playing as well. Do they capitalize nearly as efficiently? Probably not, but golly, the damage he was outputting in the back end of these fights was absurd. Like, this was just, Viper playing like the best player in the world, which he can do on any given day. He has that kind of ability, and I think that's really what we got here in game number one. I think you can also, like I said, give a lot of credit to Peanut, not only the peel in the back half of the game, because that's the thing that I think a lot of people are going to be kind of looking out for, but just the aggressiveness, the understanding, the wherewithal, if you will, to notice that Canyon's like in a bad spot on the Xin Zhao and to be able to catch that out and actually do something about it. Peanut was incredible here in game one. Zeka was pretty solid on the Azir. Delight had a pretty decent game on the Rel. A couple of engages going a bit wide, but a couple of them being very valuable. Zeus at times was taken advantage of on the Rumble. I think this is one of those matchups where it really depends on the team comp who you value in the later part of this game. Typically, I think Rumble is just easier to execute on than something like Gwen is, but the fact that you're looking at two drafts that I think are both really phenomenal, like sometimes I'll criticize both teams' drafts. I think both teams have really clear-cut drafts. I think that both index into not only the strengths of their own team, but also, the strengths of the meta at the current moment, just in different directions. Things like Talia Xin Zhao is the answer to Azir, but also for HLE, they're indexing into team fights because they're super consistent in that area, and they get Peanut his signature Poppy, but Gen.G end up answering with Gwen on the top side that can kind of, interrupt a lot of what Azir wants to do. So Rumble is, kind of on the other side, and now you've got the two best top laners. Varus is the most consistent ADC, but Jin is great weak side. Like, I think every decision made in draft here was smart and solid and probably almost exactly what I would have done, and that's what makes it so impressive to see that HLE can just go out and execute better. But the Rumble ended up not scaling in the way, that's kind of the transition that I was trying to make out of that. The Rumble ended up not scaling in the way that maybe I wanted to. He still was useful. The equalizers are still going to be big down the stretch of this game, but he was a big reason why they were in a goal deficit to begin with, alongside, Peanut and Delight and even Zeka to an extent that were a little bit overextended at times, maybe didn't team fight perfectly in the mid game. But at the end of the day, all that matters is the win, and that's what HLE got. And then for Gen.G on the other side, it's all on Canyon. Like, truly, like, it really is just one gigantic mistake at the end of the game, and Canyon is going to get dud of the game for it. I get that Xin Zhao can be a bit difficult to pilot in the back half of some of these games. It's not always linear how you might want to play a champion like Xin Zhao, but you can't really have the mistake that he ended up having. Chovy was mega stuck in this game. Not only was he phenomenal and was like the sole reason this team was winning for a majority of this game, but even his mistake down the stretch was kind of initiated by Canyon making an even bigger mistake. I just feel really bad for Chovy, who really stepped up in game number one. It just did not end up mattering. Keen was not nearly as effective on the Gwen as maybe what you were looking for. Duro, I don't think really got to do anything on the Nautilus. There wasn't a lot of engages that ended up being super consequential, especially after like 30-ish minutes into the game. Ruler, again, was along for the ride, but he was playing Jin. He's never going to be able to carry this. When your carry duo here is Talia Jin, like, yes, you've got a Gwen on the top side, but you're naturally going to be lacking in damage in some of these 5v5s, and when HLE was able to get Elder, when they were able to control the Soul, like become really tanky because of that Mountain Dragon, it just becomes difficult for this comp to actually be able to break through them, and that's exactly what ended up happening. So Gen.G is now, down in this series. They have their backs up against the wall, really for the first time this year. Obviously, you don't want to lose game number 2. Going down 0-2 to Hanwha Life Esports is basically a death sentence. Reverse sweeping a team this good is very difficult, but for HLE, if you can get that 2-0 lead, wow, like your playoff resume is starting to look actually unbelievable for some of these players and for this organization. So this would be a massive game 2 win for them if they can get it, but will they be able to? Let's find out, because the winner of game number 2 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And now we've got a real problem on our hands if we are Gen.G. For the first time all spring split, Gen.G have lost 2 games in one series to one team. They have not, obviously lost 2 games in these best of 3s that they've been playing in the regular season. They've never done worse than 2-1. This is the first time they've ever lost 2 games, especially back-to-back, against any team since, again, the finals of last split, of winter split. So this is massive for HLE, and now not only have you set yourself up into a position where you control the rest of this series, but you've done so in dominant fashion. Even if you end up going into game number 3, you're going to have blue side for games 4 and 5, and you've won both of your first 2 games on red side. This is already such a gigantic advantage for a team like HLE, and quite frankly, they're doing it through just being better. This game was not nearly as close as game number 1 was. It was very back and forth. In that first game, it took a comeback from HLE and a mistake from Gen.G to be able to pull it back, but here in game number 2, they just outplay them, and they do it really off the backs of their best players. Let's go ahead and talk about draft as we do at the start here. I don't think either of these drafts scale particularly well. I don't think either of these teams really want to go into the late game, and that really signals to me that whoever is able to utilize their pressure in the mid game more is going to have more opportunities, and that's why I just like HLE's draft a tad bit more. You look at the individual matchups that they have going for them, and even like the jungle situation that they have going for them, and I just feel like HLE are going to be allowed to be more aggressive in the mid game. You've got things like Ahri into Ryze that I think are pretty positive, at least in specifically the mid game for the Ahri. Ryze ends up becoming a bigger damage threat in the later part of the game, but at least in terms of playmaking, Ahri should have prio in the early game. Same thing for Kalista Renata. I know that people have been answering this with something like Ezreal Karma or these more poke-oriented lanes that can kind of take Kalista's advantages away because they're pretty safe and they generally can deal a lot of damage, but if these skirmishes are going to break out, that's where Kalista is going to thrive, and Ezreal, while he's good in those exchanges, is not going to be as useful as the other 2v2. Same thing for Jarvan going into something like Trundle. Jarvan's actually seen a bit of a resurgence here with Vi, still being a popular pick, but being basically permabanned across every major region. Jarvan has kind of been that secondary option. It's Vi, but like a little bit worse, and a lot of teams can still capitalize on that. This B1 Trundle did not work out. I really hate Trundle blind, and I think this was another good example of that, and I think that pressure, kind of trio right there of the Jarvan, the Ahri, and the Kalista just makes this game pretty difficult for Gen.G to actually play out, because they really do need to have a gold lead going into the mid game. They're not going to consistently be able to team fight. You don't really have a lot of setup here. There's no actual engage threat on the side of Gen.G. So for HLE, with the fact that they have a lot of not only like actual full engage, but if they get to late game team fights, you can play protect the Kalista as long as she has gold. You have a ton of peel on this team, like a lot of peel on this team. And if that's going to be the case, then Viper can still take over the game. And that's exactly what he did. Viper is once again going to get player of the game. He has come out of the gates swinging here for HLE. Absolutely unreal through the first 2 games. I would argue this game was even better, although he was already great in game number 1. His positioning was, immaculate. It was just as good in this game, and I think he was even more of a focal point for where HLE wanted to put their resources in the early game. We already talked a bit about how the Kalista is actually not really in all that much danger in this game. Typically, when you see these counter picks down in the bot lane, it's things like Ashe that can really take away some of the things that Kalista does well. This is more so Ezreal just kind of staying alive for Ruler, but there was a gigantic 2v2 gap, not only in terms of just the output, like what actually happened, the CS differential, the gold differential, all of that going in favor of HLE, but in terms of the skill level. Like Viper has has just outplayed both Ruler and Duro throughout this series, and I think he's kind of making his case that, Ruler had a great end of the split, but I'm still the best AD carry in the world, and you still have to consider me that. He is definitely selling me on that, info right now. Delight obviously deserves to be a big part of this conversation, as well as Viper is playing. If you don't have a support that's going to be able to follow up in as great of a fashion, it's going to be a bit more difficult for the Kalista to take over. Delight on the Renata has been incredible. He's been the best support in the world across this year, and I think that is continuing right now. I also think Zeka was gorgeously good on the Ahri in this game. Chovy did not have nearly as successful of a mid game as he did in game number 1, where he was hard carrying on the Taliyah. Zeka actually was able to move around the map, and I think a lot of that ends up being the matchup more so than it is these individual players. Taliyah into Azir is naturally going to have more tempo moving around the map, and Ahri into Ryze is naturally also going to have more tempo moving around the map. So for Zeka, I think it's really just about getting him into a situation where he is going to be able to push forward and utilize the things he's actually good at. Peanut was great on Jarvan. Zeus was really great on Camille, taking advantage of a weak side Sion that could not survive the damage coming in from this Camille. Overall, just a gorgeous game from HLE, and right now they're just outclassing the team that's been undefeated so far. And for Gen.G, you are slamming the panic button. If you lose this series, think of how disappointing that will be. And I know, you have that extra life. You're still probably going to be able to go to MSI because you've got another chance after this, and basically nobody's been able to beat this team regularly. But this would be another example at, 0-2 if you get swept, especially at 0-3, where it's HLE, a team that should be considered the best in the world because they step up when it matters the most, and Gen.G falling to the wayside yet again. You cannot allow that to happen, and you certainly can't play the way that you have in this series so far. The only player that has even been remotely relevant has been Chovy. In this game, he still was probably the best player on Gen.G, and he was also getting outclassed by Zeka. In game 1, it wasn't even close. He was trying his hardest to 1v9 on the Taliyah, but everybody else on this team has shit the bed so far in these first 2 games. Canyon is once again going to get dud of the game. What a miserable start to the series. Not only is Peanut mega gapping him, but he is just looking entirely mentally lost. After that big mistake at the end of game 1, he comes out in game 2 and looks very boomed. If that's the case, Gen.G is actually doomed. Canyon cannot play like this and have this team survive. Ruler and Duro, though, underratedly are just getting outplayed. There is no other way to say it. They have absolutely been on the back foot this entire series, and if they're going to be the worst bot lane by a lot, that's how things start to spiral out of control. Keen ends up picking a weak side top laner in Sion, trying to be safe, and gets punished incredibly hard. He was very weak in this game. Again, it is genuinely just Chovy, and when Chovy is losing and doesn't have pressure in the matchup, like Ryze doesn't into Ahri, I don't know how they win these games, so it's starting to get concerning. Gen.G's on their last life. They have to win this game number 3 to even stay alive and push it to a game number 4. For HLE, you only have to win 1 of the final 3 games against a team you just beat twice on red side. They are looking incredibly good. Are they going to be able to close this out in one of the most shocking sweeps that we've seen all year long, or is Gen.G going to be able to stay alive at the very least for 1 more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive at the very least for 1 more game, and they're going to do it in a fashion they needed to do it in, a confident and dominant fashion. Quite frankly, they needed to come out in game 3 and not just win it, but prove that they can be the better team in a series like this. For me to feel confident at all that this is going to be a relevant series to talk about moving forward, they are certainly not out of the woods just yet by winning 1 series, but staying alive 1 game at a time is how you need to take the rest of a series like this. For HLE, unfortunate that they just play their worst game of the entire split right now. I say that a bit hyperbolically. They've had some pretty bad games against Gen.G in the regular season, but, they were pretty awful here in game number 3. It was not a good look. They got outplayed basically in every conceivable avenue, and a couple of players in particular just played quite bad here in game 3, and that just made it pretty easy for Gen.G to stay alive. Now, I'm not freaking out or anything for HLE's sake. They're still up 2-1 in this series, but you definitely don't want to have another performance like this as we continue to move forward. It's definitely worth talking about draft because, once again, I think we have a similar situation where both of these teams kind of spike at similar times. I think Gen.G really needs to make plays in the mid game, specifically around their big pick tools of Nico Ultimate and, Skarner, and then obviously Aurora trying to follow up, even Kai'Sa trying to follow up on a lot of those engages. I think if they're not able to get gigantic leads in the mid game, things end up falling out of control for this comp, because while they do scale really well, Kai'Sa is a pretty inept inevitable win condition. It's not like Aurora or Skarner, end up falling off in the late game or anything like that. They're just going to get a bit more oppressive as games go along. It's not like HLE also don't scale incredibly well. You're playing around the double melee solo laners with the Sejuani in the jungle. Obviously, this time it's Zeka on Sylas. Maybe not his most famous champion, because the Akali definitely stands out in that regard, but certainly one of his most famous champions in terms of just him as a player. It's the Akali, it's the Sylas. Like, this is the Zeka champion pool as we know it, and unfortunately for HLE, he played pretty awful in this game, but at least in terms of the identity of this, you're definitely playing for late game team fights. You've got Sejuani and Leona as pretty clear setup. Jax can side lane if you need him to. Sylas can 1-3-1 if you want, or you can take these 4-1 or even 5-5 fights with Jax coming in, with the Corki being a potential primary carry, especially with how Viper has played so far, and Zeka being able to take over fights as well on the Sylas. Like, I understand the idea, and I don't dislike the draft from HLE. Do I think they have as much pressure in the mid game? No, but do I think they have more pressure like pre-6? Absolutely. Like, I think they should have been controlling the map, and I think a lot of the early objectives should have probably gone their way. It just didn't really end up working out like that. They didn't play well enough in the early laning phase to really be able to capitalize on that, and so that's really the takeaway for me, is that Gen.G was just kind of better in terms of execution, and specifically Canyon was really good in this game. He's going to get player of the game for game 3, and boy, did we need to see this. He was a game-losing piece in game 1 and game 2. He was a really big problem for Gen.G to be able to answer back and, play something like Skarner that's, very effective, but also not the most difficult champion in the world. Can be pretty useful in multiple scenarios to pick that up and then really be able to run the map in terms of the things that he's creating. You just needed to be able to see it from Canyon. The biggest concern for me, and I talked about this in game 2, was just that it felt like he was mental boomed. If he can come out here and, really stabilize himself in this third game, be able to get his head on, like, that's how Gen.G can stay alive in this series. If Canyon did not play well, I think things would have gone from bad to even worse. I think this could have absolutely been a sweep if Canyon did not step up here on the Skarner, but it wasn't just him. Ruler and Duro actually had a really nice bounce back game as well. We talked about them being much worse than Viper and Delight in the first 2 games here. They were definitely more active here in game number 3. The Kai'Sa ended up actually getting fed, which is a big piece of this comp, and Duro was a huge playmaker on something like Nico. That's his strength as a player. When you put him on things like Rakan, things like Nico, these things that are a little bit more aggressive in terms of maybe how they want to look, even something like a Bard, like, that's the playstyle that I think of when I think of Duro and what he has shown at the LCK level, not just for Gen.G, but for Sandbox last year, or FearX, I should say, last year as well, and it's nice to see him be able to go back to those roots. So Canyon, Ruler, Duro being able to step up and be big pieces here, and then obviously Keen Sante, his best game of the series up until this point. I wouldn't say that he's been awful, but he certainly wasn't good in game number 2 on the Scion for him to be able to play probably the champion he's most associated with now, even if I still think that's the Renekton in my brain. Him playing the champion that he kind of has a nickname for and popping off on it and being really relevant in these team fights down the stretch, that's also very positive. And that's with Zeus actually having all the gold on the side of HLE. Chovy being the last player I talk about is always a good sign for Gen.G. That usually means that the team is winning, because Chovy's almost never going to be a liability or a weak link. It's just not really how he operates, and he was good on the Aurora, definitely better than Zeka on the other side. So nice win for Gen.G, and keeping yourself alive is all you need to do, one game at a time. And then for HLE, obviously it's a bad loss. You don't want to sit there, but man, you sucked in this game. Like, looking at the tape, it's like clearly your fault. Zeka is the obvious choice for dud of the game. This was a miserable Sylas game, and that's very weird to say about a player like Zeka, who in these big best of 5s doesn't really have games like this, let alone on the champions that he's most famous for, like the Sylas or the Akali. But man, this was just a bad look, all things considered. It wasn't just Zeka, but I do think he was the biggest problem. You can point to the bot lane as well. For as good as Viper and Delight have been, Viper in particular, who's been unreal at the start of this series, boy, was he entirely awful and useless in game number 3. Part of it's not his fault, but also Corki Leona should dominate the early game in this 2v2 matchup, and that didn't really happen. The reason you end up picking Corki here on R4 is because you scale really well. You can play for that, late game team fight win condition with Jax potentially split pushing that 4-1 idea that I referenced, but also Corki does really well because of the range into Kai'Sa early and can actually just really pump out damage and make that lane difficult for Kai'Sa to be able to survive in, and that just didn't really happen here. Again, Viper and Delight not really playing up to the level that you would want. Peanut was pretty far behind in terms of tempo. Part of that was just the fact that his laners were losing, but part of that is that, Canyon played really well in the Skarner as well. And then finally, Zeus on the top side was the only one with any sort of resources or gold. I'm not really blaming this game on him, but this is why you don't really pick Jax or Yorick in these big moments for your star players, because if you're drafting a champion for your star player to be disconnected from the rest of the team, then you can't really assist them when things kind of start going wrong for them, and that's kind of what happened here. So for HLE, you're not panicking just yet. You're still up 2-1. If you win win this game number 4, game 3 feels like a complete outlier, and it feels like something that is definitely to be put on the back burner. But if Gen.G can now take game number 4, especially with how things have been going and how dominant Gen.G is, if we can push this to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, things get very interesting very fast. So a big game 4 that HLE kind of needs to win, and so does Gen.G, of course. The winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and the reverse sweep is all of the sudden very much on the table against the team that most people consider the most clutch in the entire world. I do not think a lot of people saw this coming, not only after the 2-0 start, but even just generally after, everything that's happened this split. Being down 0-2 in the first place was already so shocking for Gen.G. For them to now win games 3 and 4 and be able to make their comeback, it's even more surprising. This series has just been full of interesting tidbits, and Gen.G, quite frankly, has been excellent across the last 2 games, but for HLE, it's starting to get a little bit concerning because you definitely didn't want to allow Gen.G to have really any sort of foothold in this series. You don't want to give them any sort of place to grab onto, and that's exactly what you've given them across these last 2 games. You've just underperformed, you've made big mistakes, and you've drafted comps that are a little bit more difficult to execute, and that means that you're now sitting at a spot where you have to win a game number 5. All you had to do was win one of the final 3. Well, now it's just 1-1. Can you take that 5th and final game? But before we start talking about Silver Scrapes, before we jump in to that final one, let's talk about how we got there with game number 4. As per usual, of course, these 2 drafts are pretty difficult, weird to kind of talk about. I think HLE's is more straightforward in terms of what they want to do. First of all, it's Zeka once again on a melee carry. That's where he's been at his most comfortable. It's Viper on a hyper carry in the late game, and it's Peanut on Maokai, one of his best champions. And so it's, again, going back to this comfort idea, but the problem is there's not really a lot of ways for HLE to control the tempo of this game. Yorick is not necessarily going to be dominating a Cho'Gath or anything like that on the top side. Is Yone really good into TF? Yes, I think that that's generally considered to be, the way things go, but Lee Sin, for the most part, is going to cancel out any aggressive tendencies that Yone is going to be able to show. In the middle of the map, Canyon's just going to be everywhere in the early game, and so, am I looking at Yone being able to take over this game as big? Probably not. TF still has the macro, presence with the ultimate, even if I don't really like the 1v1 matchup into Yone in particular, but Senna kind of offers the other positive lane here, because I think early on, Senna Alistar should just be winning into Jinx and Lulu. I really don't think there's going to be a lot of avenues for this hyper carry enchanter duo to be able to dominate like a 2v2 against an Alistar that should just be able to step up and kind of do whatever he wants in this laning phase. And so you end up in this situation where HLE don't really have tempo in the early game. They're going into a Lee Sin and an Alistar that should just kind of be able to do what they want. And then they do spike really hard in the late game, but Gen.G also have scaling threats. Senna's going to be a problem in the late game. Cho'Gath is obviously going to become an even bigger problem in the late game, and you have a ton of engage on the side of Gen.G. And so when that pressure ends up going to use, and when the Lee Sin can kind of move around the map and do really whatever he wants to do in this one, and a couple of nice combos that I'll obviously talk about, that's ginormous for Gen.G, and it ends up basically just straight up winning them the game. Add on top of the fact that Zeka just played quite bad once again in game number 4, back-to-back games where Zeka honestly just feels outclassed not only by Chovy, but by himself in terms of his own gameplay. You get into a situation where it does start to get a bit concerning, and so that's kind of the draft breakdown. But for Gen.G, player of the game is once again going to go to Canyon. He's 4 for 4 so far, and either player of the game or dud of the game. We'll see how that continues onwards, but the Lee Sin was by far the most relevant champion in game number 4. His ability to just, run the early and mid game and be really aggressive in that regard, but also have these crazy combos, like the kick into Cho'Gath eat is very funny. Watching somebody just immediately get slam dunked into execute is just, it's never not going to be an entertaining thing to see. Add on top of the fact that, again, Chovy, I think, played this game really well on the Twisted Fate. I was really skeptical of this pick in draft, not only because I think TF is generally just crazy weak in terms of damage right now. You're not drafting this champion because he can hurt in any conceivable way. You're doing it because of Gold Card and because of his ability to move macro-wise, especially with things like Ryze and Galio and, even Pantheon or whatever, Talia, not being available in places like game number 4. I get the idea of Twisted Fate. I just think his numbers are a little low to be able to execute that well. But when Chovy's coming out and just playing as well as he is, when he's always in the right spot at the right time, it almost doesn't really matter what champion he's playing and whether or not it's strong, whether or not it's weak. It's going to be able to function really well. And again, Chovy was awesome in this game. But Canyon being the one to kind of primarily not only set up but follow through a lot of these plays, leading the team in kills on something like Lee Sin, you just need it. If Canyon's going to be mentally locked in, if Canyon's going to be playing well, that changes the entire dichotomy, the entire entire outlook of the rest of this series, and it has up until this point. Canyon's last 2 games have been absolutely phenomenal, and he is the biggest reason why this team is sitting in a game number 5. Of course, Keen deserves a lot of credit for that as well. I think Cho'Gath is kind of underplayed. Like, I think that there are situations where Cho'Gath is actually super valuable in the top lane. Ironically enough, this is one of them. Like, this is definitely going to be one of those situations where Cho'Gath is incredibly valuable, not only because it's pairing up with something like a Senna, and I think Cho'Gath Senna is just so impossible to deal with if you do end up getting to like the super late game, but even on top of that, again, like the combos, like TF being able to gold card people into execute, Lee Sin able to kick people into execute. There are just a lot of really fun things you can do with Cho'Gath, and I really just like the way that Keen ended up playing this. So nice game from the top side here. Already talked a bit about Chovy. Ruler and Duro were along for the ride as well. As much as I was hyping up that the Senna and the Alistar should actually be able to do a lot in the early game, it wasn't really them who was establishing a lot of that pressure. It was the middle of the map and even the top of the map that really was able to kind of push things forward. But it's not that Ruler and Duro were bad, just that they didn't have to be the main characters in this one. So for Gen.G, this continues to be massive. The fact that this team is now sitting here, going to a game number 5, all they have to do is win 1 game against HLE. They can definitely do that, and they've already shown that. They dominated games 3 and 4, and now they're really in the driver's seat of where this series goes from here. And for Hanwha Life on the other side, you're definitely starting to get at least a little bit concerned with where things are at, specifically because Zeka has just been really bad the last 2 games. He's once again going to get done of the game here for game number 4. I don't know what's going on, man. Zeka is known for his clutch factor. He's known for his ability to step up in these big series, specifically against Gen.G and against Chovy the past couple of years. He's kind of been the Chovy killer, at least domestically. He's been able to take down this guy in, game 5s, big moments, big finals over the past couple of years, and he's really letting his team down right now. He is the reason that they're in this situation to begin with. Now, I'm not putting the blame entirely on him. I don't think Peanut's been particularly good over the past couple of games. Do I think Viper and Delight have lived up to what they were in the first 2 games? Absolutely not. Zeus has been the best player on this team in their losses so far, but to me, Zeka is the clear weak link right now of HLE, and that's completely unacceptable for a player that, again, they rely so much on in these big best of 5s. He is the identity of Hanwha Life as a team in terms of stepping up in these clutch moments, being able to overperform in domestic playoffs. He's going to have to lock in, especially because the 2 games that he played his worst on in this series are 2 of his better champions, Silas and Yone, being the picks here. Obviously, comfort is not working for him right now. Maybe even going to something a little bit more passive for Zeka might be the way to go. Play more for Viper, and I get it, you had the hyper carry here, but the bot lane was never going to get going without intervention coming in from Maokai, and it just was not going to happen without mid lane pressure. So much going on that was kind of in a negative zone for Hanwha Life, but now they're sitting in a disaster zone. If they lose this game number 5 and get reverse swept by the undefeated team, you had it. You had it in the palm of your hands and you let it go. You have to win this game number 5 and establish yourself as the clutch game 5 team like you did last split. And for Gen.G, if you can complete this reverse sweep and take down the game 5 goats in HLE, that's already a big story in and of itself. So the biggest Silver Scrapes game number 5 we could have gotten. The winner of this qualifies for MSI, and they are your de facto spring split champions here in the LCK. Who's it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and the reverse sweep somehow, some way has been completed. This team that had been undefeated in best of series in this split up until this point had their backs against the wall. I think that's honestly being generous for where they were at after game number 2. It looked like they were dead in the water against the most clutch team in the entire world, and yet somehow, some way, we are sitting here at the end of game number 5, Gen.G having won 3 games in a row, taking advantage of what people consider to be the clutchest player in the world, and they will make their way to MSI as the de facto LCK champions from the spring split. Obviously, this is incredibly disappointing for HLE. I hate to kind of take a victory lap here, but 3-2 was not a common prediction. I think a lot of people thought this was going to be a lot more unbalanced. Gen.G 3-2 was, of course, my prediction in the previous video, but I had no clue that this was going to be the direction that it took to get there. If anything, I would have said it would have been the opposite of this, with Gen.G potentially taking the first 2 and HLE clawing their way back into the series. But Gen.G had to stay resilient, they had to stay hungry, and they had to get themselves out of their mental funk, and that's exactly what they did. Right now, there is no doubt about it. This is the best team in the world until proven otherwise, and they proved that here today. So let's go ahead and go over game number 5. I wish this was a more interesting game to talk about. There are some pieces to, I guess, discuss when it came to the individual specifics of this game, but for the most part, this was really just, kind of a repeat of what we had in Game 4, where Gen.G is just a little bit better, they have a little bit more to do, and they're able to execute a little bit cleaner as we go further along throughout this game. But again, let's go ahead and talk about it here. Obviously, when you're discussing draft between two drafts that are kind of like this, I think that there are some pretty easy observations to make. Gen.G definitely have more pressure on them in the early game, mostly due to this Lucian Aatrox, like, top bot side lane combo, because you don't really want to try and get to a war where you're playing against Lilia, Gnar, Xayah, Rakan in the late game. It's just going to be a bit more difficult for you to be able to play that out the longer this game ends up going, but I will say you have a ton of engage on this team and a ton of ways to play team fights if you have the gold to be able to do so. Wukong is obviously one of the better teamfight engagers in the entire game. At the moment, it's not like Lucian Zoe is going to be like a low damage mid 80 carry duo, a carry duo if you will. Like, they're still going to be able to pump out a ton of damage as they did throughout this, and Aatrox is a great midline separator, even if I think he is more of an early game champion in his current state right now. Gen.G definitely have tools. I just think HLE are going to be a bit more consistent there, and theoretically, you should actually be looking at a couple of these lanes pretty positively if you're Hanwha Life. Zeka gets his Jace. This is a champion he played a lot at the beginning of his career when he was playing in the LPL. If people remember that stint on Billy Gaming that he had, obviously, he played a lot of Jace over there, and I think you look at this matchup, and that's kind of the idea he wanted to go for. He wanted to try and snowball the game out of mid lane and then get gold onto Lilia, onto Xayah, onto these characters that could make it a lot easier to win at 20 minutes, and if that would have worked, things would have been pretty easy for HLE, but for the third game in a row, Chovy mega gaps Zeka in the mid lane, and that really ends up being the gigantic difference in this series. Chovy is going to get player of the game for game number 5. Chovy was excellent throughout this series, and like I said, I think you can make a strong argument that he is player of the series for this team. In fact, I think most people are going to make that argument. I'm not quite making that argument here, but he gapped Zeka in the 3 games that mattered the most. Hell, even in game number 1, Chovy was better than Zeka. Like, 4 of the 5 games of this series, he stepped up and played the way that we know Chovy can play. This is the best player in the world for a reason. Zeka is considered kind of the Chovy kryptonite, the most consistently clutch player in LoL esports, and yet Chovy is the one to step up and be more clutch in this series. The Zoe was incredible, and I don't know if that necessarily translates to his KDA. You look at 1-1 and 10, and you kind of feel, okay, it was a pretty good game, but maybe Ruler did more, or maybe like Keen or Duro ended up doing more. Anybody who watched this game will realize just how big of a lead Chovy had and just how important he was towards the success of this team, particularly in game number 5. But player of the series, your de facto finals MVP for me, maybe a bit controversially, is going to go to Canyon in the jungle for me. And I know that that's a very weird sentence and statement to end up making because he quite frankly solo lost them the first 2 games of this series. But game 3, game 4, he dominated and he still was incredible here in game number 5. Those Wukong engages, like I would argue that you could make a strong case that he should be player of the game for game number 5. And if that's the case, if you're looking at all 3 of their wins being off the back of Canyon being potentially the best player on the Rift, that's ginormous for Gen.G. And so yeah, Canyon's player of the series, regardless of what happened in the first half of this series. Just big ups to Canyon for keeping the mental. I was really worried about him going into game 3 being boomed. He was anything but. He locked in the back half of the series and really elevated Gen.G like we know Canyon can. This is a very interesting draft and not the most simple one to execute on, but he absolutely made it worthwhile. Ruler and Duro definitely stepped up after Viper was untouchable in the first 2 games. Duro in particular had a really great back half of this series, a great game number 5 here on the Braum. Ruler was pumping out damage on something like Lucian. He was significantly more consistent in lane throughout the back half of the series, and Keen was great. Like, Zeus, easily the best player for Hanwha Life in this series. I don't even think a lot of people are going to argue that. Maybe Viper because he was so good in the first 2 games, but Zeus was the only one even trying in some of their losses, and yet Keen was still relevant in the back half. So you just got to be excited for Gen.G. They actually do it. They actually come away with the reverse sweep, and they come away as your LCK champions. And then for Hanwha Life on the other side, what a disappointing collapse. Like, there were many different outcomes here. Almost every outcome where I would look at this and be like, well, HLE lost to Gen.G. They put up a good fight. They went to 5 games, and that's about as good as you can ask for from, a team that, wasn't really able to touch Gen.G at all in the regular season against an undefeated powerhouse. Like, you're not really too worried about it, but it's the specific way that they lost. Like, the only way that they could have lost where I would have genuinely felt disappointed about this team is getting reverse swept, and that's exactly what happened. And specifically, it's Zeka just, quite frankly, shitting the bed in the back half of this series. He's gonna get done of the game for the 3rd straight game. Games 3, 4, and 5, he was nothing if not the worst player on the Rift. And again, for somebody who's developed this reputation of being arguably the most clutch player in the entire world, to do this in such a big environment, to be the king of game 5s, and to let your team down in this game number 5, playing some of your signature champions champions that you played a ton of over the course of your career. It's unacceptable. And the only reason I'm not going to go even more in on Zeka is because this really does feel like a one-off type of bad performance from him. He doesn't play like this in situations like this. He is so good usually in these big moments, but it just did not translate to this series, and to me it was the biggest problem. Viper was also very bad. His worst game of the series here in game number 5. Really not a great time for that to happen. The Xayah needed to be relevant here. It just wasn't. Zeus had his worst game of the series here in game number 5. Also, not particularly good. Peanut and Delight, they were generally fine. Peanut in particular tried his best in this game on the Lilia, but again, very difficult when all of your lanes are losing and you're trying to play a carry jungler. So at the end of the day, you have to look at this holistically for HLE. The holistic answer is it's a disaster that they lost this series because they were up 2-0. They're not done just yet. Obviously, because they were a top 2 seed, they got the benefit of having that extra life, something that no other team outside of these two would get the option to have. They go on to now play T1, who won earlier on, or I guess after this, in this video. We're going to talk about that in its own separate video, but if HLE look back and they were up 2-0 on a team like Gen.G and they go and lose to T1 and miss out on MSI, miss out on the Esports World Cup, that is worst case scenario, complete disaster for HLE. It was in the palm of their hands and they threw it all away. But Gen.G was there to capitalize. They were there to pick up what HLE did not want to keep, and that was a series victory here. They're not only going as the number 1 seed from the LCK, but again, they are going undefeated in this split. Right now, they are clearly the best team in the world with the best player in the world in Chovy, and it's going to take a lot to really dethrone them from that position. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK round number 3 overview and analysis video in the Road to MSI, the Spring Split Playoffs, whatever you want to call it. You can see up on your screen, Gen.G, the first team to officially qualify for MSI representing the LCK, and they will do so as the number 1 seed, as the de facto champions, as I've been calling them throughout this entire video. Of course, congratulations to them, but we don't quite know who's going to be joining them just yet, and that's where we can take a look at the bracket, the final look at the bracket that we are going to get here, because there's only 2 teams remaining, only 1 series left, and it's a battle for that second spot to go to MSI, for that second seed, and it's a really, really fun one. Of course, it's Hanwha life because they threw away the reverse sweep here in this upper bracket winners finals. I don't even know what to call this 1 versus 2 matchup, the de facto championship game, and then T1, who have been able to take down their telecom rivals in KT Rolster and put a stop to their gauntlet run. The winner of this series will be going international. The loser will not be, and that's really interesting because I think you can make an argument that, again, these might be 2 of the top 3 to 5 teams in the entire world. That's how good they are, and so for one of them to be missing MSI is already a really big surprise for a lot of people, and for me, it's difficult to predict a winner here. That being said, if you're just going off of the tape that we've seen, it's really hard to bet against Hanwha Life. I think this is just one of those teams that seems to figure it out, and I think especially because they won the first stand tournament, they're going to be pretty itching to go back international and defend their crown. But look at all the other teams that were at first stand. Not a lot of them showing up right now. You've got teams like Team Liquid missing out. You've got teams obviously like Top Esports missing out. K-Corp missing out, and so maybe HLE is going to join that collection. Maybe first stand is going to be a pretty interesting look at teams that weren't able to make it to MSI, and if T1 is able to step up and play their own brand of league like they were able to at the end of that series against KT, that's probably going to be the case. But at least for now, I think HLE is better, and quite frankly, I think they're better by quite a lot. I know they're Game 5 merchants, but I would expect this series from what we've seen so far this year to be like a 3-0 or a 3-1 in favor of HLE. They've just shown so much better tape. If they can play like they did in the first 2 games against Gen.G, this series is not going to be close, but they have to be able to close it out. That's usually not something they're all that bad about. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that takedown in the comment section below. Always curious to know where you guys land on my predictions, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to go game by game with HLE versus T1 for that final spot in the same way that we did for Gen.G versus HLE in today's video, but we're covering other regions as well. The LPL Finals video is upcoming. That was obviously this previous night. I'm excited to go over that. We've still got to talk about some LTA North in terms of how their playoffs are going down, so a lot going on, and MSI is just around the corner. We're going to be covering everything at that tournament in that same vein, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all